My neighbor called me at midnight with a voice so shaky she could barely speak. She said, "Don't look out your window. He's watching you." I asked who was watching me. She whispered two words that made my blood freeze. "The man in black." 10 minutes later, detectives knocked on my door and told me I'd been stalked by a serial killer for 3 weeks without knowing it. My name is Sloane Parker. I'm 31 years old and I work as an accountant. The woman who saved my life that night was Mrs. Diane Fletcher, my 68-year-old neighbor who lives directly across the courtyard from me. My best friend Kira is 32 and works in real estate. We've been friends since college. My older brother Tyler is 35, a software engineer who lives in Tucson with his wife and kids. Detective Anthony Reed was the lead detective who investigated my case. The man who stalked me was Kenneth Walsh, a 43-year-old IT contractor who'd been terrorizing women for years without getting caught. If you want to hear how one phone call from a vigilant neighbor stopped a predator who'd been watching my every move, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button, because this story will change how you think about your own safety. 3 months before that terrifying night, I finalized my divorce after 6 years of marriage. It was amicable, but it still felt like my whole life needed a reset. I decided I wanted to live alone for the first time in my adult life. I found a ground-floor townhouse in a gated community in suburban Phoenix. The complex had about 40 units arranged around a central courtyard with a pool and nice landscaping. What sold me on the place was the security. There was controlled access with a guard at the entrance, security cameras in all the common areas, and keycard entry at the main gate. After the emotional exhaustion of divorce, I wanted somewhere I could feel completely safe and start fresh. My townhouse was small, but perfect for me. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room that faced the courtyard through big windows. I loved those windows because they let in so much natural light during the day. I decorated exactly how I wanted without having to compromise with anyone. I adopted a cat named Pepper, who became my constant companion. I worked from home 2 days a week and went into my office the other 3 days. I got into a comfortable routine pretty quickly. Work, come home, make dinner, watch TV or read, go to bed around 11. On weekends, I'd meet Kira for dinner or drive to Tucson to visit Tyler and his family. I was finally building the life I wanted on my own terms, and I felt good about it. Directly across the courtyard from my townhouse lived Mrs. Diane Fletcher. She was a retired elementary school teacher who'd been in the complex for 15 years. She was sweet and observant, the kind of neighbor who noticed everything happening in the community. She had a small patio where she watered her plants every morning and evening, and from there she had a clear view of my front door and windows. We developed a friendly relationship right away. She'd bring me homemade cookies sometimes, and I'd help her carry groceries from her car. She told me she liked keeping an eye on the neighborhood, making sure everyone was safe. I thought it was charming. I had no idea how much that habit would matter later. The complex had a security guard named Ray Torres, who worked the evening shift from 4 in the afternoon until midnight. He knew most of the residents by name and took his job seriously. I felt completely safe in my new home. The gate was always monitored. The cameras were everywhere, and I had good neighbors like Mrs. Fletcher who paid attention. I started to relax for the first time in months. I took evening yoga classes at a studio nearby. I went on a few casual dates, but nothing serious. I was just enjoying being independent and figuring out who I was outside of a marriage. About 3 weeks before everything fell apart, I started getting a strange feeling I couldn't explain. It wasn't anything I could point to specifically, just this nagging sense that something was slightly off. A few times when I came home from work, I felt like small things in my townhouse had been moved. A chair pulled out a little, a kitchen drawer not completely closed. I told myself I was being paranoid, or just forgetting how I'd left things. One evening, I was sitting on my couch watching TV, and I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. It was such a strong feeling that I got up and looked out my front window at the courtyard. I didn't see anyone unusual. I closed my curtains and told myself I was being ridiculous. Another night, I was getting ready for bed, and I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside my bedroom window. My heart started racing, and I looked out through the blinds. but I didn't see anyone. I mentioned these feelings to Kira when we met for dinner, and she said I was probably just adjusting to living alone after being married for so long. She said it was normal to feel a little jumpy. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, something felt wrong. I just didn't know what it was yet, or how bad it would get. The night that changed everything was a Wednesday in late September. I'd worked from home that day and spent the evening doing laundry and meal prepping for the week ahead. Around 10, I settled on my couch with Pepper to watch a show I'd been following. I'd left my living room curtains open because I liked seeing the courtyard lights at night. It made me feel less alone. Around 11, I got ready for bed, let Pepper out onto my small private patio for a few minutes like I did every night, then brought him back in and locked the patio door. I went to my bedroom, got into bed, and was scrolling through my phone when it rang at exactly midnight. I saw it was Mrs. Fletcher calling, and my stomach immediately dropped. She never called this late. She was always asleep by 9. I answered, and the panic in her voice was instant and terrifying. Mrs. Fletcher said my name and then very urgently told me not to look out my window, to not open my curtains, that there was someone out there watching my house. My heart started pounding immediately. I sat up in bed and asked her what she meant. Who was watching my house? Her voice was shaking so badly, she could barely get the words out. She said there was a man dressed completely in black standing in the courtyard, staring at my windows. She said he'd been standing there for at least 20 minutes, completely still, just watching my townhouse. She explained that she'd gotten up to get a glass of water and happened to look out her window. At first, she thought it was just a neighbor walking through, but then she realized she didn't recognize him, and his behavior was all wrong. He wasn't walking anywhere. He was just standing there staring. Mrs. Fletcher said she'd already called the police and they were on their way, but she wanted to warn me not to look outside or do anything that would let this man know I was aware of him. I felt frozen with fear. My bedroom window faced the side of the building, not the courtyard, so I couldn't see what Mrs. Fletcher was describing without going to my living room. Every instinct in my body told me to look, to see who was out there, but Mrs. Fletcher kept repeating that I shouldn't. I asked if I should call 911 too, and she said she'd already done that and officers were being dispatched. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to my living room, staying low and away from the windows. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I asked Mrs. Fletcher if the man was still there, and she said yes, he hadn't moved at all. Then it hit me that my living room curtains were wide open and my lights had been on all evening. If this man was staring at my windows, he could see directly into my lit townhouse. He could see my furniture, my things, maybe even see me moving around. I felt completely exposed and violated. I reached up from below the window and quickly pulled the curtains closed without looking out. Within 5 minutes, I heard sirens getting closer. Mrs. Fletcher was still on the phone with me, and she said she could see police lights at the complex entrance. Then her voice changed, and she said the man in black had turned and was walking away quickly from my townhouse, toward the back of the complex. She tried to describe which direction he went, but it was dark, and she lost sight of him between the buildings. I heard car doors slamming outside and voices. Someone knocked firmly on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers in uniform standing there. I opened the door, and they immediately asked if I was Sloane Parker and if I was okay. I said yes and tried to explain that my neighbor across the courtyard had called about a man watching my townhouse. The WOW officers said they'd received that call and had searched the immediate area but hadn't found anyone. They asked if I'd personally seen the man. I said no, only Mrs. Fletcher had seen him from her window. The officers started asking me questions that made my fear even worse. Had I noticed anyone following me recently? Had I received any threats or strange messages? Did I have any ex-boyfriends or anyone who might have a reason to harass or watch me? I answered no to everything. My divorce had been completely amicable. I hadn't had any conflicts with anyone. I had absolutely no idea who would be standing outside my home watching me at midnight. One of the officers asked permission to look around the outside of my townhouse and check all my windows and the patio area. I said yes immediately, desperate for answers. While they searched outside, I called Mrs. Fletcher back to thank her and make sure she was okay. She said she was fine, but badly shaken. She described the man as tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing all black, including what looked like a black jacket and dark pants. She couldn't see his face clearly because of the distance and the darkness, but she'd gotten an overwhelming feeling that his behavior was predatory and wrong. The officers came back inside a few minutes later with grim expressions. They said they'd found fresh footprints in the mulch outside my bedroom window. Someone had definitely been standing there very recently, close enough to look directly into my bedroom. One of the officers immediately radioed for someone to check the security footage from the complex cameras. Within 20 minutes, Ray Torres, the security guard, arrived with his supervisor, and they pulled up footage on a tablet right there in my living room. What they found made everyone go completely silent. The footage showed a man dressed in dark clothing entering the complex on foot through the pedestrian gate at exactly 11:47 p.m. He'd waited in the shadows until a resident's car entered through the main gate, then slipped in behind it on foot before the gate could close. He walked with purpose directly to my section of the complex, stood in the courtyard, staring at my townhouse for 18 minutes without moving, then walked around to the side of my building near my bedroom window. When the police siren started approaching, he'd quickly left through the same pedestrian gate. The footage was grainy because of the low light, but his behavior was undeniably predatory. He knew exactly where he was going. This wasn't random. The officer in charge told me I needed to file a formal report and asked me to come to the police station first thing in the morning to speak with detectives who specialized in stalking cases. I barely slept that night. I pushed my dresser against my bedroom door and kept every light in my townhouse on. Pepper stayed on the bed with me, and I jumped at every single sound outside. The next morning, I went to the police station exhausted and terrified. I met with Detective Anthony Reed from the Stalking and Threats Unit. He was a serious man in his late 40s with gray hair and tired eyes, like he'd seen too many cases like mine. He asked me to walk him through everything that had happened. Then he asked permission to look through my phone and check my social media accounts. I handed over my phone immediately, desperate for any answers about who was doing this to me. Detective Reed spent about 20 minutes scrolling through my phone, my social media, my messages, while I sat there getting more anxious by the second. Finally, he looked up at me and asked if I'd noticed anyone taking pictures of me recently, or if I'd been tagged in any posts by people I didn't know. I said no, nothing like that. Detective Reed turned his computer screen toward me, and what I saw made my stomach drop so fast I thought I might be sick. It was an Instagram account I'd never seen before. The username was just a random string of numbers and letters. The account was set to private, with no profile picture and no followers that I could see. But Detective Reed explained he'd gotten an emergency warrant to access it because the account had been flagged in their investigation. He started scrolling, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The account contained over 60 photographs of me taken over the past 3 weeks. Photos of me leaving my office building carrying my laptop bag. Photos of me getting into my car in the parking lot. Photos of me shopping at the grocery store reaching for items on shelves. Photos of me sitting in a coffee shop working on my laptop. Photos of me walking into my yoga studio. And dozens of photos taken outside my townhouse. Some were taken from a distance across the courtyard. Others were much closer, taken from just outside my windows. There were photos of me through my living room window, sitting on my couch watching TV. Photos of me on my patio with Pepper. Photos of me in my car stopped at red lights. Every single photo had been taken without my knowledge or permission over the past 3 weeks. Some of the photos had captions that made my skin crawl. One said, "Beautiful as always." Another said, "Watched her for an hour today. She never noticed me." Another said, "She doesn't know I'm here, but soon she will." The most recent photo had been posted the night before at 11:52 p.m. It showed my living room window lit up from the outside, taken from the courtyard. That was the exact time the man in black had been standing there watching me. Detective Reed let me process what I was seeing for a moment before he spoke again. He said this wasn't just someone with a crush or a random creep. This was organized stalking behavior from someone who'd been systematically following me, learning my entire routine and documenting my life like I was some kind of project. The private Instagram account was his trophy collection, where he could look at photos of me whenever he wanted and relive the moments he'd been watching me. Detective Reed explained that the next step was identifying who owned the account. He had tech specialists already working on tracing the IP address and any other digital footprints they could find. He asked me to make a detailed list of every place I went regularly, every person who might have access to my schedule, anyone new I'd met in the past month, any interactions that seemed even slightly off. He also strongly recommended I stay somewhere else for at least a few days until they could identify who was behind this. My first thought was to call Tyler and go stay with him in Tucson, but I didn't want to leave my job or disrupt my life even more than it already had been. I called Kira instead, and she immediately said I should come stay at her apartment for as long as I needed. Before I left my townhouse to go to Kira's, Detective Reed arranged for a security company to come install cameras and a proper alarm system. He also assigned extra patrol units to drive through my complex multiple times per shift. Detective Reed called me that same evening while I was at Kira's apartment with an update that changed everything. The tech team had traced the Instagram account's creation and activity patterns. The account had been created exactly 3 weeks ago, the same day the first photo of me appeared. But whoever created it had used a VPN and other tools to hide their real location and identity, which meant this person knew what they were doing, technically. Then Detective Reed said something that made my blood run cold. He'd run the stalking behavior pattern through a national database and found striking similarities to several other cases in Arizona over the past 2 years. 5 different women in Phoenix and surrounding areas had reported being followed and photographed by an unknown person. In 3 of those cases, the stalker had eventually broken into the victims' homes while they were inside. 2 of those women had been physically assaulted. The stalker had never been caught because he was extremely careful and left almost no physical evidence. All the victims described him similarly: a man in dark clothing, average to tall build, always wearing something to hide his face. Detective Reed said if this was the same person, I was in very serious danger because his pattern was to watch victims for weeks and then escalate to direct contact. Detective Reed proposed something that terrified me, but also made me feel like I could finally fight back. He wanted to use my townhouse as bait to catch this stalker. The plan was for me to post publicly on my social media that I was going out of town for the weekend, making it look like my townhouse would be empty and unoccupied. But in reality, undercover officers would be stationed inside and around my property, waiting to see if the stalker tried to break in. It was risky because it meant using me as a lure, but Reed said it was their best chance to catch someone who'd been evading police for 2 years. I felt absolutely terrified thinking about it, but I was also angry. This person had stolen my sense of safety, invaded my privacy, documented my life without permission, and made me afraid to live in my own home. I wanted him caught and stopped before he could hurt me or anyone else. I agreed to help with the plan. On Friday morning, I posted on both Instagram and Facebook that I was driving to San Diego for a long weekend getaway and wouldn't be back until Monday. I posted an old photo from a beach trip I'd taken months earlier to make it look authentic and current. I made absolutely sure my posts were set to public, so the stalker could see them. Then I went back to Kira's apartment and waited while Detective Reed and 3 other officers took up positions in and around my townhouse. 1 officer was inside my townhouse sitting in the dark. 2 more were in unmarked cars parked nearby with clear views of my front door. Detective Reed was in a surveillance van monitoring all the security camera feeds in real time. I watched everything on my phone from Kira's apartment miles away, my heart pounding so hard I felt sick. The first night, Friday, nothing happened. All day Saturday, nothing. But Saturday night at 11:43 p.m., my doorbell camera caught movement, and I watched in real time as a figure dressed entirely in black walked up to my front door. I was on the phone with Detective Reed, and I could barely breathe as I watched the screen. The man in black tried my door handle and found it locked. Then he moved to the side of my townhouse, heading toward my bedroom window. Detective Reed's voice was calm but urgent as he said they had visual contact and the suspect was attempting to enter through the window. I watched helplessly as the man used some kind of pry tool to force open my bedroom window. The second he started climbing through, every light outside flooded on, and officers moved in from all directions, shouting commands. The man tried to run, but was tackled to the ground within seconds. He was handcuffed and pulled to his feet, while I watched through the camera feed with tears streaming down my face. Detective Reed came back on the phone and said the words I'd been desperate to hear. "We got him. It's over." I completely broke down crying with relief and residual terror flooding through me all at once. The man arrested trying to break into my townhouse was Kenneth Walsh, a 43-year-old IT contractor who lived alone in an apartment about 15 minutes from my complex. Detective Reed called me the next morning with details that made everything even more horrifying than I'd imagined. When officers executed a search warrant on Kenneth's apartment, they found an entire room dedicated to stalking. There were multiple computer monitors, professional camera equipment, photo editing software, and printed photographs of different women taped all over the walls. Kenneth hadn't just been stalking me. He'd been actively stalking 5 women simultaneously, tracking their movements, documenting their lives, building obsessive files on each of them. He kept detailed handwritten journals about every woman, noting where they went, what time they left their homes, what they wore, who they talked to. In my case, his journal entries talked about his plans to enter my home, what he would do once he got inside, and what he imagined our relationship would become. Reading excerpts of those entries made me feel physically ill. Detective Reed explained how Kenneth had initially targeted me. He'd seen me at a Starbucks near my office about a month ago and followed me to the parking lot. He'd placed a small magnetic GPS tracking device under my car that allowed him to follow me home and learn where I lived. Once Kenneth knew where I lived, he began his surveillance routine. He researched my townhouse complex, figured out the security vulnerabilities, like the pedestrian gate that didn't close fast enough, and started his systematic stalking. He'd done this exact same pattern with 5 other women before me. What made Kenneth particularly dangerous was his technical knowledge from working in IT. He knew how to avoid leaving digital footprints, how to use VPNs to hide his online activity, and how to exploit weaknesses in security systems. Detective Reed told me that if Mrs. Fletcher hadn't looked out her window that night, if police hadn't responded so quickly, Kenneth would have eventually entered my home while I was there. His journals made it crystal clear that was always his endgame. The other 5 victims were contacted and asked if they wanted to press charges now that their stalker had finally been identified. All 5 of them said yes immediately. Kenneth faced multiple felony charges, including stalking, attempted burglary, assault, and criminal harassment, across all 6 cases combined. Kenneth Walsh's trial took place 8 months after his arrest. I had to testify about discovering the Instagram account full of photos, about the terror I felt knowing someone had been watching and documenting my life without my knowledge for weeks. The 5 other victims also testified about their experiences with Kenneth. 2 of them described in heartbreaking detail how he'd broken into their homes and assaulted them before disappearing. Kenneth's defense attorney tried to argue that he had mental health issues and was obsessed but not truly dangerous. But the prosecution presented his detailed journals, his plans written in his own handwriting, all the surveillance equipment from his apartment, and testimony from forensic psychologists about predatory escalation patterns. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than a full day before returning guilty verdicts on every single count. Kenneth Walsh was sentenced to 25 years in prison with mandatory mental health treatment. When the judge read the sentence, I felt like I could finally breathe again for the first time.